Mr. Bowen, I just want to go back to the document that the PBO released in August last year, which projections of government spending over the medium term. And in the last paragraph of the overview at page 3, you talked about, and I'm quoting, there are risks to the economic outlook over the medium term due to uncertainties in the international outlook and as the Australian economy transitions out of the resources investment boom to broader-based growth in the non-resources sector. Is there anything you'd like to add to that statement, given the events of the past few months since August? Does the uncertainty still exist?
Senator, we still believe that from the work that we have done, that the medium-term, budget outlook is quite vulnerable to a range of risks on both the receipts and the payment side of the budget. The budget is, of course, in MyEFO, the government has projected tax receipts to rise they propose to cap the level, I think, at 23.9% of GDP. If this were to occur, this would be significantly above the average level of tax receipts over the past 30 years. There's been an average of about 22.3%. And of course, that projected growth in receipts is premised on the MyEFO economic outlook that assumes 5 years of above-trend economic growth from 2016-17, after which growth is assumed to return to trend. And that's straight out of MyEFO. This would represent more than 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth. It's plausible, but it's subject to risk. You've drawn attention to what we said in our projections report about the outlook for the international economy. I don't want to say too much more about that. Others can comment perhaps with more authority, but at the very least, it is uncertain. And if our terms of trade were to deteriorate further, this would have further adverse implications for the budget. Will achieve its long-term average growth rate of 1.5% per year. Now, over the past 30 years, labour productivity has not been able to sustain a growth rate above the long-term average. It's possible it will, but there is a risk. On the payment side, payments are projected to decrease to 24.7% of GDP. This is slightly below the long-term average of 24.9%, so it would be quite low. First of all, this assumes there will be no net new spending over the 10-year projection period. And this tends to run counter to experience and to public expectations of continuing improvements in government services. To put it in context, over the 13 years to this year, 2014-15, policy decisions by government have, on average, added 2% of GDP annually to payments. So that is another risk. Secondly, the payments projection includes unlegislated savings that amount to a projected $18.9 billion or 0.7% of GDP in 2024-25. So if these savings of this order are not realised, projected net debt in 2024-25, on our calculations, would rise from the 4.7% projected in MyEFO to 9.5% of GDP. So, as I said, the medium-term outlook we consider to be vulnerable. And history shows that significant economic downturns can impact quite quickly and materially on the budget and have fairly long-lasting impacts. For example, in the recession of the early 1980s, the budget balance deteriorated by 3.5% of GDP over the course of 2 years. Deficits persisted for 5 consecutive years, and net debt peaked at 10.3% of GDP. In the recession of the early 90s, the budget balance deteriorated by 5.6% of GDP over a period of 3 years. Deficits persisted for 7 consecutive years, and net debt peaked at 18.1% of GDP, and that was and remains a 40-year high. The MyEFO projections envisage 11 consecutive deficits out to 2018-19, with net debt peaking at 17.2% of GDP. So if the risks of the budget materialise, we could easily see an even longer run of consecutive deficits with a consequential further adverse impact on net debt. The medium-term outlook provides little or no fiscal buffer, so the government's ability to make use of accommodative fiscal policy in the case of a significant negative economic shock is therefore quite constrained. This would require additional borrowings, which would add to net debt, in turn further constraining the government's expenditure policy options. So we still see significant risk to the budget.
So given what you've said about the risks to payments and the risks to receipts, the challenges of economic growth being able to correct the budget position, the requirement to deal with fiscal consolidation is real and urgent. Mr. Bowen, I'm just trying to summarise what you've just shared with us.
Yeah.
No, that's not fair. That's not fair. I mean,
can I say?
Sorry, Senator Lugby, you're not fair. That's right.
Sorry. I think the requirement. Can I just comment?
Of course, yeah, please.
I'm happy to comment. The requirement for fiscal consolidation certainly exists. This is not a situation that we can continue to live with over the longer term. Over the longer term, you don't hear, we haven't heard these arguments much of late, but it is a fact that over the longer term, increasing debt risks crowding out private sector investment and negatively impacting economic growth. Now, I'm not suggesting we're at that point, but over the longer term, that is another risk that has to be managed.
I might just go to, because you did in your summation there, you did mention the issue of community expectations.
Yeah.
And in the overview to the August report, you do reflect on the issue of expectations. And I just want to read the quote, your quote in the overview. And my question is, has anything changed since August to change your view of what was in this paragraph?
No,
you know the one I'm talking
Senator,
about.
I think we would stand by our view in that report.
And the quote is that the sustained period of strong growth in Australian government spending over the past decade can reasonably be expected to have lifted the Australian community's expectations of continuing higher levels of government services and benefits over the medium term. Realising the projected slowing in the pace of growth of Australian government spending implies successfully adjusting these expectations.
That was our view in the report. We are still of that view.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay.